My grandma never cried until I found her war diary. She was one of those old-school American women who held everything in. Her eyes had seen the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, and the loss of her husband, but they never showed tears. Only calm, iron resolve, and the coffee she brewed every morning like a ritual that kept time from slipping. Her name was Alice May Barton, and I grew up in her home in Ohio. She was my world after my mom left and my dad disappeared into the armed forces. She never talked about the war, ever. All I knew was that she had been a nurse in a field hospital in France during World War II. But that summer, when she turned 92, she fell out of bed for the first time. We called the ambulance, and when they took her, I went back to pack her some things for the hospital. I opened her closet, and there, behind some old coats, was a metal box. Inside were yellowed letters, black and white photos, and a dark green diary. It began simply. June 6, 1944. They call it D-Day. But here in Cherbourg, we just wait. The ward smells of blood, bleach, and fear. I sat on the floor of her room and started reading. Her words cut through me like glass. This wasn't just a war story. It was a soul laid bare. She wrote about holding a young man's hand. His name was Thomas, as he asked her to send a letter to his sister. About how she lied to the dying, telling them they'd be okay. About how she kept silent screams inside when the man she loved died, Lieutenant David Holden. He was a pilot, her patient, and later, her secret. They wrote notes on the back of medical forms. She never told a soul about him, not even after the war. And when his plane didn't return from a mission, something inside her broke. But outwardly, she stayed stone-faced. She wrote, "I wasn't allowed to cry. When nurses cry, more men die. I learned how to be silent while the world exploded around me." I held that diary like scripture when Grandma was discharged. I brought it to her hospital room, and when she saw it in my hands, for the first time in my life, she cried. Silently. Just tears. She didn't ask for it back. She didn't scold me. She just said, "I thought I'd have time to burn it." And that's when we finally talked. Not about war, about pain. About how she carried in her bones the screams of boys dying with Mom on their lips. About the letters she promised to deliver but never did because they burned with the bodies. So I made a choice. I restored every name she kept scribbled between the pages, surnames, dates, brief notes. I found their families. I mailed those letters. I traveled to Boston, Texas, North Carolina, even Canada, to deliver what she had been too afraid to. When I came home, she was gone. But I knew this. She left knowing her story didn't die with her. And that truth, even 70 years later, can set a soul free. Because even those who never cry deserve to be heard. After Grandma passed, the silence in that house felt thicker than ever. I spent days sorting through her things. Not because I had to, but because I needed to. I needed to understand her, now more than ever. Her diary had cracked open a world I never knew existed. But there were still gaps. Questions she didn't have time to answer. There was one name that appeared more than any other in her writing, David Holden. Sometimes just D.H., sometimes my flight boy. There were pages soaked in emotion, written in a rushed hand, with tear smudges staining the ink. I wanted to know who he really was. So I started digging. First, I found his military record online. Lieutenant David Joseph Holden, born in 1921 in Syracuse, New York. Enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1942. Served in the 385th Bomb Group. Killed in action July 18, 1944. Aircraft went down near Cannes, France. But that wasn't enough. I needed to find someone who knew him. Someone who remembered. I called the local American Legion in Syracuse. They didn't have much, but one old veteran gave me a tip. Try the Holden family farm outside Baldwinsville. If anyone's left, they'd be there. So I drove to upstate New York. The farm was still standing. Weather-beaten, but alive. A woman in her 70s answered the door. Her name was Linda Holden, David's niece. She looked like she'd seen a ghost when I said my name and showed her the diary. "Alice," she whispered. "My grandmother used to say that name in her sleep sometimes. We never knew why." I stayed 3 days. We read the diary together. I showed her the letters. She brought out an old photo album, and there he was, David, in uniform, standing beside a fighter plane, the name Lucky May painted on its side. Linda froze. "He named that plane after her," she said. And that's when it hit me. My grandmother was the May. In the attic of that farmhouse, we found something that stopped my heart. A box filled with letters David had written, never sent, addressed to Alice M. Barton, Cherbourg. Most were returned by the military, marked recipient unlocatable. They had been writing to each other from different worlds. And now, 80 years later, the messages had finally come home. Linda let me take them. Said they belonged with the woman who inspired them. I placed them next to Grandma's diary when I got home. Then, I did something I never thought I'd do. I wrote their story. I sent it to a veterans publication. They published it. Then a journalist picked it up. Then a podcast. Then a documentary team called me. Turns out, people still care about truth. About love. About sacrifice that goes unseen. One day, I got a letter from a young woman who read the article. Her grandfather had served in the same field hospital as my grandma. She sent me a photo. 3 nurses and a young pilot, sitting under a tree, smiling. And there she was, Alice May Barton, laughing. And next to her, David Holden, looking at her like the war didn't exist. I cried, because sometimes the world moves so fast, we forget who it moved for. And sometimes, it takes one diary, one memory, to remind us. My grandma never cried. But when she finally did, it washed away 80 years of silence. And in that silence, I found her. I found myself. And I found the truth that made us both whole. They say you can't miss what you never had. But the moment I stepped off the train in Cannes, France, I missed something deeply, something I never knew I was missing. It was David. Not just the name, not the uniform, but the man my grandmother had loved in silence. The one who vanished over these skies nearly 80 years ago. I came to Normandy not to find his body. He'd never been recovered, but to find his memory, to find the space he left behind. I'd never been out of the country before. My passport still smelled like glue, but something compelled me to walk where she walked, to stand in the same light she wrote about. Cherbourg, Bayou, Cannes, small town still scarred by war if you look closely enough. Bullet holes hidden beneath ivy, fields that once held tanks, and a wind that never seemed to forget. I carried a copy of the diary everywhere. Locals helped where they could. I met a historian named Luc Moreau in Cannes who specialized in the Allied Medical Corps. When I showed him Grandma's handwriting, he looked up sharply. "Barton," he said, "your grandmother is in one of our archives. I think I can show you something." He took me to a small museum annex that smelled of parchment and preserved sorrow. There, on the wall, was a photo taken in August 1944. A group of nurses and doctors in front of a tent hospital. And there, seated in the middle row, was my grandmother, looking younger than I'd ever imagined, her hair pinned, her eyes tired but unbroken. Luke pulled a binder off a shelf. Inside were handwritten transcripts of field reports and personal statements. He stopped at one. This was submitted anonymously, but it mentions a May who stayed with a pilot in his final hours. He handed it to me. My fingers trembled. "I write this for no recognition," it began, "only to record what should not be forgotten. On the night of July 18th, a nurse stayed with a downed pilot. D.H. was all he could whisper. She held his hand until his last breath. She sang to him. That night, war did not win. I sat in that archive until the sun dipped behind the tiled roofs. Back at my hotel, I pulled out the last letter David had written. It was dated July 15th, 1944, 3 days before his crash. It ended with, "Tell May, she gave me something this war can't take. And if I don't make it, she'll still have all of me, in the quiet, in the mornings, in the sky." He knew. Somehow, he knew she'd never stop hearing him. The next day, I went to the field near Saint-André where his aircraft was last seen going down. A farmer guided me through the rows. Said his father remembered the crash. Said for years, pieces of metal would turn up when the soil was tilled. He handed me one, a small, twisted shard with faded blue paint. It might have been from the wing. From Lucky May. I held it to my chest. That evening, I stood alone in that field. The sun was low, orange against the wheat. I read his letter aloud. Then I read hers. And I let the silence between them speak. When I flew home, I carried that shard with me. I placed it on my grandmother's grave, right next to the diary and a photo of David in his uniform. There was no plaque for him there. No military headstone. But now, they were together. Somewhere beyond the soil, beyond the silence. Together again. And for the first time since I'd opened that box, I felt peace. Not closure, but peace. Because this wasn't just her story. It was ours now. I thought the story ended in Normandy. It felt complete, like I'd tied the final knot in a long-forgotten thread. But grief, like love, has a way of leaving pieces behind. And one of those pieces arrived 3 weeks later in the form of a package. No return address. No explanation. Just my name, written in that sharp, slanted handwriting I recognized instantly. It was hers. Inside was a smaller box, wrapped in cloth, and a letter dated 2 months before her fall. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. And if you're reading it, I trust you. That's all I ever needed. My hands trembled. I sat down on the floor of my apartment, sunlight streaking through the blinds, and read. There's something you don't know. I didn't just leave the war behind in France. I left someone. Not David. Someone else. Her name was Elise. I stopped. The letter went on. We met at the Red Cross post in Cherbourg. She wasn't a soldier. Not a nurse. Just a local who helped run supplies. Spoke English with a lilt like honey. Brave in ways I never was. She taught me to smoke clove cigarettes and swear in French. We kissed behind ration tents when the air raid sirens were quiet. I reread the sentence 3 times. I never told anyone. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't know where to place that love. Not in 1944. Not in 1954. Not even in 1994 when your mother asked if I'd ever loved anyone besides your grandfather. I said yes. And I meant Elise. My chest ached. After David died, Elise was the one who sat beside me every night. She taught me how to breathe again. And then, in October, her name stopped appearing on the morning roll call. Germans hit a convoy near Cannes. She was there. They never found her body. Inside the wrapped box was a brooch, simple, silver, with a carving of an iris. She gave me this the night before she left. Told me to wear it if I ever forgot what mattered. I wore it under my uniform for the rest of the war. But I never wore it again. I held it in my palm like something sacred. This wasn't the end of my grandmother's story. It was another chapter, one she'd buried deeper than the others. A love silenced not by time, but by shame the world taught her to carry. And now it was mine to carry forward. So I did. I booked a flight. This time, I flew to Paris. Then took a train to Normandy again, to Cannes, then to Bayeux, then to a little hamlet called Le Grandvay, where Elise had been born. I had one photo from the envelope. A sepia image of 2 young women laughing on the steps of a makeshift canteen. One of them was Alice. The other, brown eyes, a crooked smile, a scarf wrapped like a crown, was Elise. I visited every town archive I could. Every cafe, every museum. Most people didn't remember her name. But in Bayeux, I found a woman, Colette, who recognized the photo. My aunt, she whispered. That's my Aunt Elise. She invited me in. Her living room smelled like lavender and would smoke. She showed me a chest filled with letters Elise had written, hidden away by the family after her death. Some were addressed to A. B. Never sent. I read them all. I don't know if you'll ever come back. I don't know if you'll remember me when the war ends. But I'll remember you. Not the way you smiled. Not the way you moved. I'll remember how you made the world quiet. That's all I ever needed. Colette placed her hand over mine. You are family, she said in French. Through love. Through memory. That's how we keep them alive. When I returned home, I placed Elise's brooch in the same box as David's letter. One on the left. One on the right. 2 lives. 2 loves. Both held by a woman who never let the world see how much she carried. But now we knew. Now, the world would know. Because this isn't just a story about war. It's a story about the things we bury and the love that refuses to die with them. Grief has a strange rhythm. It fades, only to strike when you're folding laundry or pouring coffee or walking by a window she once opened every morning. And just when I thought I'd found a kind of stillness, the past came roaring back, not as memory, but as invitation. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans had read the article. The curator, a tall, solemn man named Dr. Elias Monroe, called me personally. We want to feature your grandmother. Not just in a footnote, he said, but as a centerpiece in our upcoming exhibition on unseen women of the war. My throat caught. They wanted the diary, the letters, the brooch, the photo of her and Elise, the fragment of the Lucky May's wing, everything. He said they would handle it with reverence. So I flew to New Orleans. The exhibit hall wasn't open yet. Workers were still setting up panels, testing lights, adjusting placards. But in the middle of it all, behind museum glass, I saw her story come alive. A timeline wrapped around the walls, Alice's early enlistment, her field assignments, her personal notes. Her hands, printed in high-res from an old photo stretched across the wall as if reaching for someone still out of frame. David's photo was there. Elise's handwriting. My grandmother, finally seen. Dr. Monroe stood beside me. You gave us something rare, he said. A war story that isn't about bullets. It's about the aftermath. I thanked him, but I couldn't speak much. The air was thick. That night, I stayed in a small hotel off Magazine Street. I couldn't sleep, not after seeing her life turned into history. So I walked, and I ended up at the bar downstairs. The bartender was a woman in her 60s, humming an old Glenn Miller tune. She poured me a whiskey without asking. You look like you lost a war, she said with a crooked grin. I laughed. Only rediscovered one. When I told her the story, she leaned in. I served, she said. Desert Storm. You know what they never tell you? That when the uniforms come off, the silence gets louder. I nodded. The next day, the exhibit opened. People came. Hundreds. Veterans, families, school groups, local press. I stood to the side and watched them stop, not at the tanks or the medals, but at the case that held my grandmother's diary. I watched a teenage girl read Elise's final letter aloud to her mom. I watched an old man stare at the brooch for 5 whole minutes. Later, a woman approached me. She had tears in her eyes. My mother was a nurse, she said. She never spoke of the war either. Until the end. This helps me understand. And then a young man stepped forward. Maybe 25. He wore a faded bomber jacket. Quiet eyes. He held out a photo. It was a black and white portrait of David Holden. I think he was my great-uncle, he said. My family didn't talk much about him. Just said he never came home. But when I saw the documentary, I recognized the name. And the plane. My grandfather named his first son David, after a brother he barely knew. We stood there, staring at the photo. Then, without thinking, I hugged him. 2 strangers bound by grief they didn't live through. Bound by 2 people who once found love amid ruin. That night, I called Mom. Told her everything. And for the first time, she didn't dismiss it. She didn't scoff or change the subject. She said something I never thought I'd hear. You've made her proud. I didn't reply. I couldn't. But I knew. Because somewhere, in a hospital tent, or a Normandy field, or a Paris cafe, or even here among the bourbon and brick of New Orleans, my grandmother was smiling. Seen, heard, remembered. And for once, that was enough. The museum exhibit had barely closed for the day when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. New York area code. I hesitated, then picked up. Is this the grandson of Alice Barton? Yes. My name's Rebecca Lewis. I'm with the Library of Congress. We've been archiving correspondences from field hospitals, and your grandmother's name came up. Would you be willing to speak? It was strange how quickly the name Alice Barton had become something more than just my grandmother. It had become a signal, a ripple through history. We scheduled a call for the next morning. But before that could happen, another letter arrived. This one from her lawyer. It was her last will. I had already seen the official copy, modest savings, the house, and instructions for a quiet cremation. But this envelope was marked in her own hand. For you. When it's time. Inside was a single page. A letter. No date. I know by now you've read it all. Or almost all. You've walked in places my feet touched before yours. You've held my memories in your hands. You've cried for things I never dared to say aloud. Thank you for that. But there's still one thing left. Forgiveness. I paused. You see, I held so much. I let silence make a home inside me. I let grief become my shadow. I pushed people away. I punished myself for surviving, for forgetting, for remembering, for loving. I wore my strength like armor. But armor is heavy, darling. And I want you to know, you never have to carry that weight for me. Let it go. The past doesn't ask to be erased, only acknowledged. You did that. You gave me peace. Now, I give you permission to live. Fully, loudly, imperfectly, without guilt. And when the world feels too much, stand still and listen. You'll hear me, not in the silence, but in the song. Her handwriting wavered near the end, but the signature was firm. Alice May Barton, my grandma. I sat at my kitchen table until morning. Didn't move. Didn't speak. Just let the letter rest in front of me like a lighthouse in the dark. Forgiveness. That's what she needed and never received. That's what she gave and never asked for. And somehow, through all of this, she gave it to me too. The next day, I sent a copy to the Library of Congress. And when Rebecca Lewis called me back, I asked her something no one had asked before. Can you record it? Record what? She asked. Her story. In her own words. There was a pause. Then she said, "Yes. Yes, we can." A week later, I stood in a soundproof studio in D.C. and read the entire diary into a microphone. Every page. Every word. Even the ones that broke me. They'll archive the audio in the Veterans History Project. Students and families will be able to listen to her, to me, anytime they want. She won't be forgotten. Not now. Not ever. And neither will the truth she carried. The truth that set us free. After the Library of Congress recording, something unexpected happened. People started writing to me. Emails, handwritten letters, even postcards. Veterans. Grandchildren. Nurses. LGBTQ+ seniors who had kept their own Elise-shaped secrets for decades. Strangers who now spoke of Alice Barton like she was family. Some just said thank you. But others sent their own stories. Their own diaries. Boxes of old war photographs. One woman mailed me her mother's nursing cap from 1945 with a note. She never told us who the ring on her chain belonged to. Maybe someone in Alice's world knew. I started mapping everything. Cross-referencing units, battalions, names mentioned in Grandma's diary with other records. My apartment turned into a kind of archive, photographs taped to walls, string-connecting pins across maps, a whiteboard filled with initials and dates. What I found wasn't just closure. It was a pattern. Alice hadn't been the only one. Not by far. Whole networks of women had served together. Loved each other. Mourned in silence. Some lived long, quiet lives. Others disappeared into shame or obscurity. And their stories were scattered, uncatalogued, unspoken, unacknowledged. I contacted Dr. Monroe again. "This isn't just an exhibit," I told him. "It's a movement." And he agreed. With the museum's help, we launched the Barton Project, a digital and physical archive dedicated to collecting and preserving the personal histories of women and queer voices in wartime service. We built an online portal. We digitized dozens of boxes. Families donated their heirlooms. Historians volunteered. In less than 6 months, we had over 800 entries. One story stood out. A nurse named Margaret Wynne, who had served with Alice in 1944. Her grandson had kept her old Red Cross badge, thinking it was just a trinket. But inside the velvet pouch was a letter, unsent to A.M.B. Alice May Barton. In it, Margaret wrote, "When David died, I thought you'd break. But you didn't. You held us all together. You carried the room like a song no one else remembered how to sing. I never told you, but I loved you for that. Not as a sister, not as a friend, as something I didn't have words for. Maybe someday, someone will." I read it at a Veterans Memorial in Chicago, where the Barton Project was unveiling its traveling exhibit. The room went still. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about my grandmother. It was about all the women who learned to stay quiet. About the men who never made it home. About the families who kept boxes locked in attics and hearts locked even tighter. About what silence leaves behind. Sometimes it leaves ghosts. Sometimes it leaves questions. But sometimes, if we listen hard enough, silence leaves us the map. And now we're following it, all of us, together. The Barton Project grew faster than any of us imagined. By the end of the first year, we had secured funding from the Smithsonian. Universities reached out for partnership. High school teachers began using the archive in curriculum. And everywhere I went, from Kansas City to Montreal, someone recognized the name Alice Barton. But with recognition came responsibility. I was now the keeper of hundreds of stories. The guardian of griefs not mine. And some nights, when the inbox was overflowing and the media requests piled up, I wanted to shut it all off. To go back to that moment on the attic floor, when it was just me, and a diary, and her handwriting. Then came the invitation. France. The mayor of Cherbourg reached out. The city was organizing a memorial for Allied medics and civilian volunteers who had served in the region during World War II. They wanted to posthumously honor Alice May Barton. I cried when I read the email. I flew there in April. This time, I wasn't alone. I brought Linda Holden, David's niece, and Colette, Elise's grandniece. We stood together beneath the spring rain, 3 generations representing 3 silences finally broken. The mayor spoke in French, then in English. He told of bravery, of sacrifice. But then he turned directly to me. "Some people fight with weapons. Others fight with memory. You, monsieur, have kept the memory alive." They unveiled a plaque. It bore Alice's name in bronze. Below it, a single line. "She held hands the world forgot to hold." Linda squeezed my arm. Colette wept. That night, we shared dinner in a small restaurant near the harbor. Over candlelight and wine, Colette reached into her purse and handed me something small, a photograph. I knew it instantly. Alice and Elise, standing in front of the Red Cross tent, laughing. It was the same photo from her box, but this copy had something new. On the back, written in French in faint ink. To Monatoil, my star. Until the sky finds us again. We left it at the base of the plaque the next morning. And when I flew home, I finally felt something I hadn't known I was missing. Stillness. Not silence. Not emptiness. Not the unresolved ache I'd carried for months. But stillness. The kind that comes after a storm, when the sky is bruised but open, and the air finally lets you breathe. I went back to the house in Ohio. It's mine now. I kept the old furniture, the cracked porch swing, the smell of cinnamon that still lingers in the kitchen. I turned the attic into a small study. On the desk, her diary, her brooch, David's last letter, Elise's photo. Every so often, I sit there and just listen. Not for voices, not for ghosts, but for the quiet after. And it tells me, she's here. Not trapped, not grieving, just resting, just remembered, just home. A year after the plaque was unveiled in Cherbourg, I got one more letter. It came from an old man named Walter Green, a retired archivist from the Department of Defense. His handwriting was careful, almost apologetic. I believe I have something that belongs to you, or rather, to your grandmother. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. Black and white. Grainy, but unmistakable. It was taken in August 1944, weeks after the liberation of Normandy. In the photo, 5 medical staff stood in front of a tent. One man, for women. I recognized 2 of the faces instantly, Alice May Barton and Elise. But what stopped me was the way they were standing. They weren't posing. They were looking at each other. Everyone else was facing the camera. But Alice and Elise? They were caught in a glance, mid-smile, mid-breath, as if the rest of the world had fallen away. On the back, Walter had scribbled a note. Found in a mislabeled folder in 1973. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe I knew someday someone would need it. I stared at that photo for hours. Not because it was romantic. Not because it was evidence. But because it was real. For years, people had questioned whether women like Alice and Elise existed beyond shadows. History buried them in footnotes, silence, and shame. But this photo, this moment frozen in silver halide, was proof. They lived. They loved. They were here. I had the photo framed. It hangs now above my writing desk, next to the display case with their letters. Sometimes, when I sit down to work, I glance up at it. And every time, I find myself smiling not with grief, but with gratitude. Because stories are like people. They want to be known, to be understood. In this one, the story of Alice, of David, of Elise, of all of them, was no longer hidden. It was out in the light. So I wrote one final entry in her diary. On the last blank page, I wrote, she was never just a nurse. She was never just a widow. She was never just a war story. She was Alice. And Alice was love,